Deepwater Horizon rig failed and exploded in 2010, scientists were among the first responders trying to understand what might happen to the Gulf of Mexico's environment and its biological bounty. The potentially catastrophic gushing of oil and dispersants more than a mile down would affect scientific studies of species and communities already in progress. Other scientists initiated new studies, but often found a lack of solid baseline data from which to begin. Communication among scientists was further complicated by the limitations placed on the flow of information, both publicly and within the scientific community, by lawyers and government officials who hired scientists to do research for potentially lucrative lawsuits. Science takes time, months, years, sometimes decades. The following interviews, all occurring 18 to 24 months after the blowout, explore lessons learned, how the catastrophe affected the short-term research questions of a variety of labs, and whether or not it affected their future directions of research. Ed, today we're going to talk about several questions. One is, what do we know today that we didn't know a year ago? And number two is, what new research questions do you have after all the knowledge that we've gained? And then what's your prognosis for the coast based on what we know today? And related to that, what are your concerns about as time passes over the next 5 to 10 years?
What do we know now that we didn't know in the summer of 2010? Well, frankly, there's a good bit of information. During the summer of 2010, we knew that there was oil everywhere, oil on our sandy beaches, to such extent that they were virtually impossible to be used for recreational purposes. Oil on our coastal marshes from the Chandelier Islands all the way up into Barataria Bay. The bottom line was offshore environments, lots of oil floating around. Some of it got swept up a small amount into the Gulf Stream with the loop currents. So there was oil in almost all compartments of the northern Gulf ecosystem. Fast forward for a year, this summer, hard to find oil on the coastline. Still oil buried in tar mats off the sandy beaches, and when heavy weather events occur, these tar mats get broken up, and then you get a tarballing. But it is nothing even close to what it was like in the summer of 2010.
I think the point about the oil spill is that it was such a complex set of events. You know, it wasn't just one thing. We put all this oil in the water, we put all this dispersant in the water. Some of it was deep, some of it was and came up to the surface. We also closed the fisheries down. We released a lot of water from the river diversion. All of these things, and then there was all the coastal disturbance from the cleanup and so on. All of these things all happened concurrently, and disentangling all the effects from all these different events. They're all oil spill effects, right? But some of them are going to have different positive, and some of them are going to have negative effects on crabs or on other species. And disentangling all of these events it's going to take a long time.
We in this field take for granted that we understand that when you go to the ocean and you look at the ocean from the seashore and you look out, we understand that you're not really looking at the sea. You're looking at the top of the sea, and people don't understand that the real action is down below.
We know that there was lots of oil that entered the Gulf of Mexico. Some of it got to the surface. We also know now that a great deal of it actually dissolved into the water down about 1,100 meters. That's about 4,000 feet below the surface, and it stayed in the Gulf, did not impact the coastal marshes. Good bit of oil, of course, did get to the surface. It meandered around offshore. When it came ashore, it was in a heavily weathered form. That's good, because heavily weathered oil is not nearly as dangerous as fresh oil coming on the shoreline.
One of the interesting things that came out of this, and it's something that people that are plankton ecologists know, but when this oil spill happened, and it was 1,500 meters of water, very deep. I mean, it's very deep. That's permanently dark down at that level. There is no real connection between things that are going on at that depth and what's going on at the very near surface. But the organisms that live in the sea, the ones that live at the surface, can't get down to a mile, and the ones that live at a mile can't get up to the surface. They are just completely separated from each other. So when this happened and all this oil was down there in the bottom, and people were starting to get pretty worried about, well, the crabs that I have that I eat, or the oysters I eat, boy, they have larvae and they swim in the water, and so all of a sudden there became this big misconception that toxicity that might be going on at a mile below the surface was actually going to somehow reach up to the surface, because the animals are moving around, and certainly the animals weren't moving around. They don't move around over those distances in the ocean, and so this distance connection from top to bottom is something. It actually was really important in this oil spill.
It just entered the environment from the reservoir, so it was a combination of both natural gas and oil flowing into the Gulf. And in fact, almost all of those natural gas components dissolved into the water column, as well as some of the oil, and it never even got to the surface. Scientists have found a very significant area, lens about 4,000 feet below the surface, that contained these natural gas components. It wasn't in the water above that, and it wasn't in the water below that.
The kind of oil itself caught the attention of scientists from Texas A&M University who were studying the natural gas seeps on the bottom of the world's oceans, including the Gulf. We Skyped in with Dr. John Kessler to see what he was finding. John, good having you with us today. We're intrigued about what scientists have learned since the BP incident. That we had that spill out there, and everybody was nervous about the impacts, and now we're looking back on what the various labs along the Gulf Coast have learned since the spill.
Yeah, what we were out there focusing on were some of the natural gas components of what was released. Since we were looking at raw reservoir fluids that were coming out, not only was this an oil spill, but it also contained a really large component of natural gas. And the dominant component of that natural gas is methane. But certainly gases can dissolve in water, much like sugar dissolves in a cup of hot tea. Now, that jet might not really approximate a natural release from the seafloor that well. However, once methane is dissolved in the water, the response of bacteria to that methane can very well be analogous to a response if methane was trapped in that water then naturally.
The submerged plume that was observed during the blowout is essentially gone. And part of the reason for that is that there are microorganisms in the environment that can utilize the oil and gas as food, and they metabolized it.
Of many samples to really be able to parse out any effect at all. But anecdotally, you just didn't see as many redfish or trout as you thought you would in similar habitats like, let's say, in Biloxi Marsh, interior Biloxi Marsh.
Our research was lucky enough to get another opportunity to go out into the Gulf, and that was in September of 2010, the end of August throughout September and beginning of October of 2010. And those experiments actually showed an entirely different story than what we saw when we were originally out there. Instead of the methane respiration rates being rather slow like we saw in June, what appeared as it happened as in the mid to latter part of the summer, that the population of bacteria that consumes that methane really got established and really were cranking on respiring that methane. When we returned in September, the end of August and September, what we saw was actually a lack of methane. And in its wake, a community of bacteria that were previously linked to methane oxidation or methane consumption, as well as a persistent reduction in the amount of dissolved oxygen.
Now, one interesting question is this area of the Gulf of Mexico unique in that regard because we have a lot of natural seeps, and so there's just naturally a big population there? Or are these organisms present throughout the environment? And so this could happen anywhere.
My research direction has taken a slight tangent to that now. And instead of trying to just ultimately quantify the absolute number that's coming out of the ocean due to these natural seeps, due to these methane clathorate hydrates, but to instead now to quantify the capacity, the kinetics of these bacteria that are capable of consuming this methane.
We've had a massive increase in microbial populations. The densities are incredible. Is that a dynamic that is going to impact crustacean populations? They are living in what is suddenly a multifold increased population of bacteria that tend to break down lipids, for example, fats, oils. That's what they're adapted to do. If this animal lives there and one of its protective coatings happens to be an oil, which it is, and they're lipoproteins, is there potential damage coming simply from secondary effects of high microbial populations? Entirely possible, totally unstudied up to this point.
There are some metals like iron, which when there is less oxygen present or no oxygen present, they become more soluble. That makes them more readily available. Other elements may become less soluble and hence go on to the sediments and become less bioavailable. So that's the way that the biogeochemical processing can affect metal distributions and hence ultimately affect bioavailability and toxicity.
Project in Louisiana history, even though it wasn't meant for that, they're going to see where the sand goes. Was it worth it? Was it functional? It's just going to all wash away, which some people believe. So, yeah, it was oil-based response, and now they're going to make the best of it and study what happens with the geomorphic change of that artificial burn.
Patrick, you want to pick up again?
Yeah, just like Dr. O'Connell was saying, so you have an opportunity in here, and I hate to use the word opportunity in the face of
shrimp are basically food for your recreational and commercial fishing. So when the shrimp harvest goes down, the commercial and recreational fisheries also go down because they don't have enough to eat. So what caused the shrimp to increase or decrease is really important. But that oil is certainly not the only thing that affects the viability of the shrimp harvest. There's the freshwater diversions that occurred during the heavy Mississippi flooding. There's temperature. Any number of issues like that can affect the shrimp harvest.
The folks that are looking for toxicological impacts of this oil spill are, as probably predicted, are having a difficult time finding real acute toxicological problems. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't any, but what it means is that they're not going to get the same kinds of answers that we saw from, say, Exxon Valdez or other major oil spills that persisted in the environment for a long time.
In those sites where once the oil got in, it could not get back out. So sites where there was little tidal flushing, low energy, you can think of these as lagoons, ponds, or sort of the upper reaches of the bayous where the tidal water does not flow in and out very often or with much current or much strength. The oil persisted for much longer, and the plants had more of a detrimental impact from that oil than in sites where there was a lot of tidal flushing and the oil was removed fairly rapidly just because of that physical energy of the water coming in and out, and washing away some of that oil that had originally come in.
Blue crabs, they live most of their lives in the estuary, and then when their females will go out offshore and spawn their eggs, and the eggs hatch very quickly into larvae or zooial stages. Those zooial are too weak to swim by themselves, so they get carried around by currents, by ocean currents. So we're using the oceanographic model to try and track those movements. When they get to about between 30 and 60 days old, they molt into what's called the megalopal stage or the post-larval stage. At that stage, they settle back into the estuary where they spend the rest of their lives as an estuarine species. So that's where we catch them usually when they're adults, is fairly in the nearshore waters in the estuaries and in Lake Pontchartrain and so on. They go through 7 different molts during the actual larval stage, while they're in the ocean, and then they do 1 molt into the post-larval stage, and then they continue to molt throughout their lives. So yeah, they're invertebrates. They have an exoskeleton that they throw off and grow a new one. So soft-shell crabs are just molting crabs that have lost their exoskeleton, haven't yet grown a new one. So.
But right now, what we're looking at, and what I'm seeing, particularly with crabs, shrimps, and lobsters, is that with those deep water species and sort of medium depth species that are in close proximity to the spill, I'm seeing gills that we jokingly call it, oh, this specimen has the black lung disease. They are coated with tiny little globules of oil, what appears to be oil, waxy substances that we do not see in pre-spill samples. That can't be good for them, but the animal was alive when it was collected and it was thriving, and with molting, a certain degree of this, certainly I'm sure the animals have ability to fend off.
We saw these orange droplets in the crabs, and we showed them to people who had studied crabs for 40 years, and they seemed to be something new. They seemed to be something that hadn't been seen before. And our first thought, they look like, if you see a picture of them, I could show you pictures of them. When you first look at them, they kind of look like oil droplets, and some of the oil was orange. So our first thought was that they were oil, that these droplets were oil. But they were pretty widespread, and we saw them, really in the first samples that we got from mid-May in 2010. In some places they were very prevalent. Places like Pensacola, Florida, almost every megalope we picked up would have these orange droplets in them. And we were also seeing them in places, in fewer numbers, but still in places like Galveston, quite far from the oil spill. And we continue to see these droplets all through the whole season, so even by late October. So we thought initially that they were oil, but we have tried to extract the droplets from the megalope and run them in GCMS, run them into chemistry on them, and as far as we can tell, they're just fat droplets. They just all we can detect in there are fatty acids and fatty acid esters and things that occur naturally in crabs.
On the other hand, we do see a higher than previous incidence of lesions, which are really what look like sores on the exoskeleton of the animal. In some cases penetrating all the way to the interior, barely skinned over. And in some cases penetrating an appendage, causing the complete loss of appendages. We're seeing cases where appendages tend to have a blackened end on them that looks like they've been attacked by perhaps a bacterial infection. We can't prove any of this. This is, observation. This is anecdotal evidence right now. But from comparisons before and after, we're seeing a higher incidence of these lesions. And so that's of concern. And we're going to look much, much harder at trying to get firm numbers on this, because we want to get beyond just anecdotal evidence, obviously. There have been some recent studies that received lots of publicity conducted at LSU with killifish in marshes, showing very similar response and gene activation.
Is that the genetic programs that got turned on, coincident with the arrival of oil, were responses that were predictive of toxicity. So the toxic pathways that are responsive to oil got turned on in our fish, so they got exposed. And we also found some of the genome programs that govern reproduction were misregulated in these fish. They were actually profoundly downregulated in some of our fish. And we also found other genome programs that are important for these fish's ability to deal with changes in salinity, which is pretty important in these environments where the environment gets salty and fresh all the time with the coming in and out of the tide. So those genome responses were quite distinct and dramatic, and were highly diagnostic of exposure to the toxic components of oil.
We're also seeing here, in terms of the gill structure, is that it's extremely highly compromised. Some of the lamellae here, which is the area that normally would be involved in gas exchange for the animal, are highly compromised. They're highly thickened. Many of the lamellae have actually become clumped together. And so it's not necessarily like an emphysema, but it has the same effect as it would in us. The animal would be suffocating the environment.
Well, what might be worthwhile saying is this represents a decrease in the surface area of the gill. And if you imagine that decrease in the surface area of the lung would be bad for us, That's bad for the fish, and the fish's guilt does even more than our lungs do for us.
Yeah.
Gas exchange.
You can go to a number of places along the coast that received oil, and in some cases you can see it on the surface. In other cases you just need to dig down a little bit. And out in the vicinity of the blowout, the sediments there definitely contain oil that appears to have come from the blowout.
More recently, we've done much more extensive sampling in the Louisiana marshes, particularly in Barataria Bay, where we've been looking at 14 different sampling sites, a good set of reference sites that have minimal oiling, to very heavily impacted sites, particularly in the middle of Barataria Bay and some of the barrier islands. And what we're finding from the sampling that we did in November 2010, and more recently in the last month and a half, towards September 2011, is that we're seeing, first off, across Barataria Bay, extensive, across this large geographical region, signs of exposure in some of these clear biological effects that we saw in the published paper. And the recent study done this year suggesting that we're also seeing those biological effects in fish sampled in situ, so fish that were exposed to those marshes. And when we take those sediments back to the lab, we're finding that those sediments are still having biological effects that are pronounced effects on developmental rate, impairment in heart function, and individuals that go on to hatch that are severely compromised.
It's been interesting because of the one example that's brought up constantly from Exxon Valdez of the herring fishery in Prince William Sound. Our counterpart organism is menhaden, and nothing's probably more important in the Gulf of Mexico in the food chain for the higher animals at least than menhaden. But they are particle feeders, and they're indiscriminate. And so they, of all the species of fish that we're concerned with, here we say keystone species that might have been exposed to floating particles of oil and things of that nature. And I think that's one of the things that we're kind of watching, I think, has to be a concern, because everything eats menhaden, including dolphins.
And then we have to make the ultimate evaluation as well. Is this affecting reproductive ability? Are we seeing new recruits? Well, many of these things reproduce really in one surge per year, and so unless you go a full year or two, you don't really know, have I all of a sudden lost my new age class? Where are the little guys that should be here? We don't know that until we go several years down the road. And so that's why, sometimes it's frustrating. People say, well, are they reproducing naturally? So it takes them a year to do that. Did they mate naturally? Did they lay eggs naturally? Did the eggs survive? Did the larvae survive in the water column? Did the larvae then settle where they normally do? We don't know that until we start picking them up in the dredges, because we're not sampling at all those different layers. I wish we had enough money and personnel to do that, but that's not all being done.
For wildlife, the population is the unit of health that we're interested in maintaining. But studying populations is hard. So what we study are predictors of population level health, and those are the things that we really have to keep our eyes on. And what predicts population level impacts are effects on development, reproduction, performance, and growth. And so those are the endpoints that is the next step for us in measuring in these fish. Because if there are effects on development, if there are effects on reproduction, performance, and growth, then those almost certainly are going to propagate to population level effects if they're widespread enough and if they persist for a long enough period of time.
Short of the problems that we have in research funding in the Gulf of Mexico in general, which is horrific compared to other places. Historically, it's horrific compared to other places in this country. The prognosis for our specific line of questions is actually pretty good. The reason I say that is because the pointers keep pointing back towards planktonic systems that, especially with this oil spill.
Now, over the long term, if the plankton turn out to be really damaged in some way or dramatically altered in some way, over time, it's reasonable to predict that there will be cascading effects that would affect juvenile snapper or small sharks or plants or what have you. And, It just takes time to properly conduct scientific evaluations, and you have to recognize there are direct effects and that there are indirect effects, and the indirect effects are harder to detect.
So we need to be doing this in many species. I say we as the scientific community, not as in our lab. We have limited resources. But we've got the data that we're seeing so far are the red flag that you would expect to see in the short term if there were going to be long-term effects. So it's not a death sentence for these fish that we're seeing right now, but they're the types of effects that send up a red flag and that tell us, and that should tell many people, we need to pay attention to this, and we need to follow up on this, and we need to do the biology. The chemistry is important to document how much, where, and for how long the oil's in the environment, but if we care about what that is doing to the animals, we need to do the biology as well.
Well, land loss is the real issue in the coastal delta of Louisiana. We are suffering massive land loss, and this oil spill accentuated that. So there are certain areas out along Paso Lutra and over in the northern Barataria Bay and in the other areas that suffered heavy oiling, and that heavy oiling caused some of the marsh grass and some of the marsh reeds to get killed. That land is exposed, and now that land's underwater.
So one of the things that we often talk about to our students when we're discussing salt marsh habitats and their submerged counterparts, the SAVs, is that these are important habitats for a lot of different reasons. They provide a lot of services to humans and to the environment, essentially, without us putting any money in or having to do anything for those services. A common one that's frequently thrown around and has quite a lot of scientific support in terms of data to prove it or demonstrate it is that these types of habitats are important for many small organisms, species that are both commercially important, recreationally important, and all those other species that are part of that food web. In addition to that fairly commonly cited function of salt marshes, they are also shown to be very important at removing nutrients. So they'll reduce the frequency of those harmful algal blooms or red tide type events. They are important for carbon sequestration, so as we go forward with global climate change and increasing CO2 gases in the atmosphere, these marsh habitats are actually very good at taking that CO2, fixing it, and then burying it so it's no longer part of the atmospheric pool. So they're important for that reason. As the folks in Louisiana know, they're important for storm surge abatement and reducing the effects of tidal flooding when you have higher tide levels due to a storm. Also for erosion control so that you don't lose shoreline as quickly, although in some areas the ability of the plants to do that is being compromised because both the land is subsiding and the sea level is rising.
The marsh is opening up, and those areas just not there now. So it won't be long before Paso Lutra is no longer there. Paso Lutra will be the open Gulf of Mexico. So you can drive down and see, and it's pretty shocking to know that before the spill there was marsh grass and it was part of the ecosystem, and now you can see the open Gulf of Mexico waters. So I think geological impact, when all the dust settles, is going to be pretty significant from this spill.
Blue crabs, they're in the marsh too. You see them on shore. So I think they're moving between all of those habitats. It's not quite, again, that would be a complex question as to whether erosion of the marsh is going to have what the net effect on a population is going to be.
What happened in the Exxon Valdez, I think this should be an important lesson here. We learned a lot of good biology. Now we're going to learn a little bit more so that we can respond and better understand some of the major consequences of future oil spills, because the reality is the way things are going, these oil spills are going to become potentially more prevalent. I
think, going forward, part of the lesson of the spill from 2010 was that we don't understand some of the critical functions and processes that occur in the Gulf of Mexico, despite many years of research by scientists in the region. It historically has been relatively underfunded compared to other regions in the U.S., other coastal regions, and we think that now that the spotlight has been cast on the Gulf, that there will be more substantial funding opportunities to start to address some of these data gaps and to help us better understand how these different habitats relate to each other, how they relate to commercial activities like fishing oil extraction, dredging, and some of those other things that go on in the Gulf at the same time and same space, same location as some of these important habitats that we'd like to preserve so that we can continue to enjoy the benefits that they provide.
We're not close in terms of the kinds of funding that would be required and the long-term commitment. I don't even know where we can find the personnel to do it because we have lagged over the last 20, 25 years in producing individuals who are capable of running much of this research. Many of us are simply overloaded at this point in terms of what we can do. It's university driven and it's economically driven. It's kind of what have we put a premium on in years past. You know, we're very good at responding to crises. We're very poor in preparing for them.
You know, it still illustrates a fundamental problem, and I got back to this earlier, is the public doesn't know what science is. And science is about making prediction based on hypothesis testing. And if that had been done before the accident, our elected officials would have better known how to react to the response and when oil and dispersants showed up, and they didn't. So knowing that they were getting enormous pressure from the taxpayers and from local governments, they just went out and did something so it looked like they were proactive in the news media. But a lot of the cases were futile. But again, if the federal government, state governments properly funded the planning that should have gone with this, no different than a hurricane. Like I said, we're very good at reacting to things. We're not too good at planning ahead for things.
A common theme is that at least two separate priorities on research funding need attention. One, baseline studies that give us a platform of understanding of the existing ecology of the Gulf of Mexico. And two, specific studies that will build on that baseline knowledge and help us understand our Gulf ecosystem now and in the future. While the public's concerns focus on direct loss of wetlands, oiled wildlife, and the impacts on seafood quality, the scientific community is focusing its concern on overall survival of coastal wetlands, impacts on coastal ecosystem communities, and long-term sustainability of the nation's seafood supply and associated public health.